So thank you very much, Dr. Vandana Prasad and Dr. Karthik. It's an honor to be here today. So the Quaternary Period sort of is the major event that happened during this Quaternary Period in the human evolution. Why it is important or why it is a major event is because it's about us, right? We always look at the world, whether we look at the Earth, we look at the past of the Earth, we look at the other aspects of the universe. We always try to look at, from human-centric point of view. The two reasons for this: one is the inherent bias that we go through in this context, because we are humans. We try to understand the world around us using our brain. We are the ones who try to make a picture of the natural world, whether causal relationship or very different correlations of very different events, very different objects in the world. We always look at from our perspective. The science has helped us to go beyond our own perspective. Otherwise, for example, we would not have seen the world in which it is the sun which moves around the earth, while our human natural perception is the sun which is moving around us, right? So using scientific methods, we've been able to understand the world beyond our own perception. So given that, the modern biology too, other than the physics and the chemistry, is trying to understand the biological world beyond human perception. And also that biological world includes us. So trying to understand us beyond our own perception, which is this where, when I mentioned philosophical, it's more than the philosophy, but also has a logical, a conflict here. That how do you try to understand yourself beyond your own perception? Because understanding us using the same brain. And so here is an interesting way of understanding us. Perhaps modern methods of physics, mathematics, data science, now artificial intelligence, and a variety of different technology that we use to understand biological world. Hopefully one day we should be able to understand so-called us or self beyond our own human perception. So I'll quickly start sharing my screen and get on to the topic in a much more structured way. So the title I have given is From Archaean to Quaternary Period, from the origin of life to evolution of self. Now, Archaean, the period is basically the very earliest history of Earth, and the Quaternary is the latest, right, in a time scale of Earth's history. And within about 1 billion years of Earth's history, we already had life on Earth. And then, whatever the origin of the very first form of life, and it is continuously evolving for the last 3.5 billion years and leading to, the kind of biodiversity that we see, biodiversity that is there in the fossils, that may not be there in the fossils, or all kinds of biological history, evolutionary history that has gone through this in the last 3.5 to 3.75 billion years, including the latest, which is the evolution of humans. And more importantly, evolution of humans is not about just evolution of another animal. Evolution of human is something which is change the earth itself, change the living life on earth, change the way we deal with our own surroundings, to an extent that, it's also becoming a concern now because of the global warming and the kind of destruction that's going on at a scale which is going to sort of, destroy a large part of the, not just the naturally, living ecosystem, also the geographical, features of Earth. This is something which is a substantial change that has happened to the Earth itself. So obviously, one needs to know what made this possible in human species, that we have achieved certain things, and we have also, started destroying our own surroundings. In a way, it's like we're shooting at our own feet. When you're supposed to use any defending weapon against certain dangers or against certain threats, instead we are trying to shoot ourselves. So it's sort of logical again, paradox that the brain that has evolved with time to defend ourselves or modify our behavior, come out with variety of different kind of survival strategies in changing world, and we are using the same brain in a completely negative way. We'll come to that in a minute. So the way I sort of structured this talk is starting with the science of life, where we try to understand the life itself and then try to understand us from that one. So understanding the life itself, I'll start with more recent history, not the 3,000 or 4,000 years of history. More recent is well documented, where there is sufficient evidence that what people were thinking and how they were trying to understand life in very different ways. Of course, one can start at much earlier time too, but for because this is a short talk, I don't want to sort of go on talking about really the history of the biology in a way. It's the history of one aspect of biology. So if you look at what Linnaean did, which with our Linnaean system of nomenclature or classification we still use in taxonomy, is trying to sort of compare plants and animals and see whether we can understand some aspect of life, see how whether they're related, unrelated, whether there is some kind of a gradual change, or if they're all created in the current way we look at it. Linnaean has thought about it. There is the written document that he has thought about the origin of all of these things, but I don't think he could come out of the notion of creationist view of of life. So in a way, but still, he could establish fantastic phylogenetic relationship based on the morphometry and across flora and fauna, which actually provided lots of initial sort of material for people to think about natural history. The next person who went beyond Linnaeus actually started thinking about evolution, although not necessarily that the Darwinian way of thinking about evolution, but at least organisms may actually have sort of related to each other, in terms of some kind of a phylogenetic relationship. That means they are relationship because they are related to each other in a way through inheritance, although they didn't really have a clear understanding of what is inherited or what is inheritance and what is genetics and so forth. But some abstract understanding that perhaps there could be relatedness, the way different human groups may be related. The distant plants and animals also could be related to each other. That kind of thinking started with the work of Buffons and many of the later natural historians. And the clear understanding of life started really in the middle of 19th century, particularly from the work of Mendel. Mendel's, what he was trying to, these are no classical, school textbook information, I'm sure all of you are familiar with. What Mendel was trying to understand is simply not how certain morphological features are inherited. Is there a pattern to that inheritance? What Mendel was trying to address is, understand some aspect of inheritance. What is inherited is, first thing is, every time a new individual is born, whether it's a pea plant or a human being, a new life is born, right? Another, individual, living organism is born. Then a human species or a pea plant is born. And then certain morphological features related to parents or grandparents are inherited. So what is inherited is all the features to be a living organism, then member of a species, and then member of a particular family. So in a way, he was trying to understand this, but it was easier to explain the inheritance of quantitatively measurable traits, which basically turn out to be morphological traits, because there was no variation. That every time a pea plant reproduces, pea plants are born. Every time a new living organism, because there are no variations, it was very difficult to even think that how very different traits making us living organisms are inherited, right? So that obviously was not really be addressable in the way the experiments were done by Mendel at that time. Around the same time, Darwin, although not known to each other, was talking about or thinking about what is life, by trying to connect very different forms of life and see whether they are related. If they're related, and how they are related, how are they sort of connected? Is it through some kind of a common inheritance and divergence, or because of something else? To cut short the whole story, what Darwin sort of proposed is every time organisms reproduce, new variants are introduced in the population, and this diverse population, whenever subjected to environmental stresses or different environmental contexts, certain variants reproduce at higher frequency, certain at lower frequency. This basically leads to formation of subgroups. These subgroups may continuously diverge if there is no intermixing happens, if they are spatially and temporally separated, or they keep mixing with each other. More variations are generated. At some point they may diverge, and once they start diverging, it's like two parallel lines and with a kink, and then start diverging infinitely. More and more distance is created between the two lines. Similarly, the two groups can become so diverged that they can become two different species or two different genera or families and orders and so forth. And that's exactly how he proposed what could have happened to life on Earth, basically through evolution. And he even proposed common origin of life. I'll come to that in a minute. Around the beginning of or late 19th century, beginning of 20th century, although microscopy was already 300-year-old, but there was an enormous improvement in the microscopy, which enabled people to see inside the cell, right? Inside not just a bacteria, not just eukaryotic large cell, also inside the bacterial cell, particularly in the context of today's discussion. Let's say take about the eukaryotic cell. Now, by the time biologists already knew by keep looking at very different features of living cell, that a cell itself is life and it's not just a unit of life. Until that, people are confused. When the cell were first discovered using a microscope, they thought it's simply a building block or a unit of life. But people, it turned out to be that there are so many unicellular organisms, and also within our multicellular system, there are many cells which are perfectly independent. And finally, they found out that every cell has its own complete, later on, of course, they found out that every cell has its own genome, every cell has its own mitochondria for metabolism and so forth, then suggesting that a cell itself is life and not necessarily a unit of life. And around the time when Mendel's work was rediscovered in the beginning of 20th century, large number of physicists already had influenced our thinking about the world. The world, Newtonian world, is deterministic world, right? Basically, if you look at what Newton proposed in his laws of mechanics, and the deterministic world means if you have a fixed pattern of anything, that must be based on matter which has mass. So if inheritance has a fixed pattern, whether it's 3:1 ratio or 9:3:1 ratio or whatever, right? And that means it must be because what is inherited must be a matter which has mass. And because of, by the time development biology or reproductive biologists already knew that every organism, at least in the context of, mouse or human or a plant, that every time a new individual is born, a multicellular individual, it starts with a one cell zygote or embryo. And that means what is inherited should be a material which is present inside the cell, right? And later on, people found out that it is something called nucleus, and the nucleus, there is genetic material, which basically is the material which what Mendel was talking about, what is inherited, right? And to cut very long 50 years of really fast developing, science, people found out what is inside the nucleus, which is certain kinds of chemical molecules, which is basically nucleic acid-based chemical molecules, and DNA is the genetic material, and information in the DNA is decoded through two-step mechanism using mRNA as a messenger, and the protein is the real workhorse of all the cells, and that's exactly the information. Information is not just to make which protein, information is also to tell which protein, when, where, and how much of that protein should be expressed in a given context. And all that information is there in the DNA, and people basically realize that the real crux of what is life is all this in the chemistry of these chemical reactions that happens inside the cell. So now we have decent understanding about what is life. It's an organized state of chemical reaction, and it has well-defined boundary conditions. to facilitate balance between energy and entropy. More importantly, all these chemical reaction that happens inside a living system, let's say a cell, is the same chemical reaction which also can happen anywhere outside in a test tube or even in natural conditions. But what is then difference between a living system or a non-living system? Because these chemical reactions happen under highly, definitive, predictive way, right? No chemical reaction, every chemical reaction is basically a stochastic event. Then how is that life is not a stochastic event? How is that every time when we see something, we respond to it, or an ant bites our toe, our brain comes to know about it, we try to do something about it. That's because these organization of very different molecules in time and space and their relative physical location, and which basically ensure that chemical reactions happen in sequence, what you call as emergence of physiology of the cell, which basically leads to what called near certain biochemical reaction, right? And this is happening for 3.5 billion years. That's the level of certainty in these biochemical reactions have achieved because of their organization in the cell. So now what we need to really understand when you say what is life is this molecular organization. These heterogeneous, very different molecules are organized in some particular way, and how do they maintain their physical space relative to other such kind of biomolecules, like say two proteins when they interact with each other, or a series of proteins when they talk to each other, and so forth, right? But what is important is also that this form of life can make copies of itself, but copy is not identical, and they actually can generate some new variants. And ways, the basic, the mechanism by which new variants are introduced in the population, but what Darwin was talking about, every time an organism reproduces, the variations are introduced, is simply there in the DNA copying mechanism itself. The semi-conservative method of DNA replication has two components, which is high degree of fidelity. So that because there are two templates, each template, new template is made letter by letter. If there is a G, C is added. If there is a TA is added. If the AT is added, or if it is a CG is added, right? ATGC, and this complementary basis. But sometimes there can also be a what's called non-Watsonian Crick base pairing, leading to C going with TA, or T is going with G, and it because they also have form hydrogen bonds. They are actually stable at a finite time, if not as stable as the original GC and AT base pairing. And because it's a double helix long polymer, these kind of weak hydrogen bonds also can be sustained for a short time. But the next time when the DNA replicates, again because of the semi-conservative method, the new variation get fixed in the population, right? By mistake, if C comes in, the next time in the place of C, the new strand will have G, and then when it again replicates, G will go with C, and then that particular position, let's say C is added, it continues and perpetuates, and that's the source of variation. And these variations, when of the evolving structure, this is going on for 3.5 to 3.7 billion years. I'm sure the people who are experts in origin of life know better than me when exactly the first current cellular form of life, DNA-based life, emerged on Earth. But anyway, all the fantastic biodiversity that we see on Earth, it's because of this long history of life. It's not one time. If humans have evolved in the Quaternary Period in the last 2.5 million years, it's not that suddenly the very different new features evolved in human. It's a continuum from 3.5 billion years. In fact, many biochemical reactions and physiological reactions evolved almost more than 3 billion years ago, and they are continuing all the way even up to human in our cells. Similarly, the kind of the anatomical feature that we see in human, whether it's the brain or in muscles or in other forms of tissues and in our body, they also evolved over a long time. There have been slight modification in each time, and that has led to species-specific features. But none of the major features have suddenly evolved in one species or the other, right? So this is what is the beautiful biodiversity on Earth is all about. Now, interestingly, when you talk about origin of life, when you give lecture, you cannot start from origin of life and then build the whole story all the way up to human evolution. It's when the way we understand, way we can understand is depending on how much we understand in one field versus how much we need to understand in other field. So origin of life is a much newer field in biology, simply because without knowing the current form of life, what is the essential features of current form of life, it's very difficult to go back and ask the question, the very origin of life. Because if we cannot define what is life, how can you even talk about the origin of life? At least now we can define what is life in the chemical, biochemical, and physiological parameters. And now it's easier to even start asking more scientifically tractable question on origin of life. Origin of life question came in Darwin to Darwin also. He written in one word about what he thought about origin of life in the last paragraph of his famous book, Origin of Species, that there could be one, origin for all life forms on Earth, which itself is a remarkable, at that time. So, as you all know now, it's a DNA to RNA to protein, and DNA to RNA to protein is through a process called translation, which happens in ribosomes. And sometime in 1970s and early 80s, people discovered that the very important reaction that happens in all living systems, which is making peptide bonds. These peptide bonds, without peptide bonds, you don't have proteins. Without proteins, there are no biochemical reactions, right? And if you are to define, if you want to start where the beginning of the current form of life, it basically starts with asking the question, where do you get the proteins first, right? More than the DNA. But to get the protein first, you need to have these peptide forms to be formed. People found out that even today, in all ribosomes, whether eukaryotic or a prokaryotic system, it is the RNA molecule which has the catalytic activity to make the peptide bonds. And that basically gave an idea that perhaps the earliest form of life was not a DNA-based form of life. It could be an RNA-based form of life, or a single molecule RNA itself could be life. If an autocatalytic RNA, it can auto-replicate and have a high degree of fidelity, of which information is not lost, and that basically means there could be an RNA world in which the life could have evolved from that point onwards. And some of the slides that I borrowed, a colleague of mine, Pune, suggests that if you look at from first 3 point or maybe a billion years or so, let's take, right? Not up to 4.5 to 3.6, about a billion years of Earth's history, if you look at it. Perhaps the first step towards life is the prebiotic chemistry. There is still a lot of argument whether prebiotic chemistry happened on Earth, or it was also seeded from outside, or Earth already had certain kinds of large molecules which basically are the basic constituent of life. Then you talk about pre-RNA world, which is some kind of a polymer which had certain kinds of information, and that leading to RNA world, which has an autocatalytic a molecule which has a high degree of fidelity, and later leading to DNA form of life, and then current diversification of life. There is also perhaps an intermediate step of formation of what's called protocells, which basically is capable of going through Darwinian mode of evolution, and that's where the evolution starts. So origin of life is one specific event, a singular event on Earth, which is still not very well understood. It's still a long way to go. Not necessarily long time to go. Perhaps our scientists will be able to tell us more about origin of life in the next 1 decade or so. But the gap in understanding between origin of life to evolution of life is much larger. Evolution of life starts with the current form of cellular form of life, where the information, infidelity in its replication, new variation are introduced. There is certain robustness in the system so that it can withstand environmental changes. Beyond certain environmental changes, the adaptation requires a more dramatic one, but that happens gradually because of this robustness. Without robustness, either organisms die or suddenly, one or two in some context may actually have certain capability of adaptation, but that can't happen all the time. So the high degree of fidelity, the information, still having some new variations at low frequency, perhaps like 1 in million, what people have observed now, and the robustness of the system makes the so-called climate resilient life, which gradually can change, right? And that's what the most important aspect of evolution. And that gradual change, if it's disrupted, that can be a threat to life itself. And exactly what the problem of today's climate change problem is, it's not going beyond this range of robustness of the living system. So this is a classical, again, textbook. The origin of life is about 3.5 billion years ago. It has been evolving for the last 3.5 billion years. It's mind-boggling, particularly if you look at from the bacterial context. It divides so fast, every 20 minutes to once a day, depending on which bacteria you're looking at. It's evolving for 3.5 billion years. Look at how many generations it may have gone through. Every time an evolution happens, there will be new genetic variations. That only happens when there is a reproduction. So that means bacteria are reproducing for 3.5 billion years, and which have a shorter life cycle. So they are evolving, and they have evolved, with remarkable diversity in biochemistry and physiology. They can live at plus 140 degrees centigrade. They can live at minus 70 degrees centigrade. They can live at anaerobic condition, extremely aerobic condition, in the air, under the rock, wherever, you see there will be bacterial life. Inside the life also there is bacterial life. In fact, we talk about microbiome, we talk about endoparasites. All these are in the evolutionary context had to happen because the bacteria have lived on this earth for 3.5 billion years. There is not a single space they would live, particularly if they're organic rich. Our cells are organic rich. Obviously, inside our cell there would be bacteria, right? It was very obvious, and now it's a reality that we have seen in the last 20 years or so. Okay, coming to the first cellular form of life 3.5 billion years ago, with this kind of a chemistry of life with new variations that can be generated. What's happening next is evolution of other forms of life. For example, evolution of eukaryote is about 2 billion years ago, and then if you look at from time scale, we're all fascinated with dinosaurs. We means all of us, all human beings, for some reason, are very fascinated with dinosaurs simply because they're very large and ferocious. We don't know how ferocious they were or not, but anyway, and it's only 150 million years ago. It's just a small, time scale wise, just a few hours ago on Earth. And human evolution, which is in the Quaternary Period, which is just current Homo sapiens is just about 200,000 years old, maybe 500,000, and it's just a dot on this time scale, right? And what's happening if you look at over time in the 203.5 billion years of evolution is this is the kind of, it's not anymore this tree of life, it's called umbrella of life now. What you see on the top of this umbrella, if you can see my cursor, all of these are bacterial life, forms of life, bacterial forms of life. A huge amount of diversity, biochemical diversity, physiological diversity, and all of these things is based, is basically making them extremely diverse. Then what you see at the stalk here, just basically here, are the eukaryotic ones. And not just eukaryotic, also some prokaryotic ones. And eukaryotic ones are here in this green one, right? And this eukaryotic includes humans, plants, in the tree outside your window, or animals, or the dinosaurs that we are all fascinated with, all come in this small part of the evolution of the evolutionary tree that is depicted here. That means more diversity, more the number of generations is the more the diversity, and the fewer the number of generations, the less the diversity, and obviously diversity is more in the prokaryotic. And in modern days, this understanding has been enabled to make people to do bioprospecting of microbial world. Now we talk about microbia, whatever the damage that we have done to the earth, they want to sort of reverse it or rectify it using bacteria, because they are the ones who can be the saviors of life if you are intelligently make best use of those bacteria. This is the Quaternary Period, which we talk about in the recent time in the history of Earth. And in this Quaternary Period, one major event that happened is the evolution of humans, which is not a one-step evolution. It's a multi-step evolution, like any other gradual evolution of all forms of life. And common ancestral ape diverged into chimpanzees and humans, and the humans went through very different, species evolved. Many, almost all of them, became extinct except one. That's us, right? Interestingly, large number of these species actually coexisted. Some of them in the same time and space, right? Not just only in time. If you look at some of these species here, which is mentioned, they are together in the same time, but they also, based on the fossil records, we know that they also coexisted in the same space, like Neanderthals and modern humans, right? And it turned out to be that earlier people thought that when Homo sapiens sort of evolved and start spreading around the world, they started killing the other species. That's how the other species got eliminated. Only Homo sapiens survived, because it was very difficult to think how an advanced species like Neanderthals, who could actually use tools, who could had all kinds of features that modern humans have, but how could they become extinct unless because of some kind of a genocidal? Because anyway, modern humans do have a genocidal tendencies. Perhaps they must have eliminated the whole species, which is difficult to believe, because no species would be congregated in one space. It would be spread across the earth. But it turned out to be that Neanderthals became extinct in a natural way, variety of different ways, because of infections and because of other ways. Typically, any species become extinct over time. The Homo sapiens and the Neanderthals, or even other species, have mixed. There is an interspecific hybridization also has happened. Particularly if you look at in the Eurasia, Neanderthals and modern humans have hybridized, and we do carry some amount of the Neanderthal genomes. Particularly Asians, the South Asians, us Indians do carry Denisovan ancestry too. Coming to India, we are landlocked, very interesting peninsular earth formation. One side is Himalayas and the three sides sea. So if through somehow individual groups of humans come through, from the West Asia towards India, and once they come, because the tendency for people to spread it's an animal tendency that so that you don't end up in resource poor state. You keep moving from place to place. Somehow you will always have some resources to survive. It's a survival strategy which has evolved amongst the animals, including humans. So, but people, when they spread, invariably, in India, they started settling down, and also some of the spreading happened post agriculture. So then tendency was to look for targeted movement. That is more called migration. Earlier it was untargeted movement. It's called spreading. So India became some kind of a melting pot of genetics and culture over the last 30,000-40,000 years. And it's a fantastic biodiversity, human biodiversity we have, which we are all proud of. Now, in few minutes, I'll talk about the second or the last part of my talk, is the understanding self. So, the human tendency, as I told you, is to understand the natural world from our context and see what is useful for us or what is harmful for us and so forth. That's how we are trying to manipulate our surroundings. But then scientists, when they started talking about more objectively trying to understand life, still they were trying to understand origin of life, evolution of life. But there's one stream continuously trying to understand is understanding ourselves. Now, understanding ourselves was always a philosophical topic or theological topic. You only connect yourself in the context of your relationship to God, not necessarily in the relationship to other human beings or to other nature around you. But there are certain philosophical contexts people are trying to understand self in that context too. But there was no clear scientific, understanding came to about understanding self. Because understanding self is the most important aspect of understanding anything, because without understanding yourself, how do you know what you have understood about outside is real or imaginary, irrespective of who talks about what. Right? But scientific methods has enabled us to be unbiased as much as possible, even to understand ourselves. There could be still a paradox, but there are ways to come out of this paradox. So, understanding us, when we talk about in a colloquial way, it's all about understanding our mind. Our mind does this. Our mind, didn't like it. My mind, says, wants me to do this kind of thing. So, general thinking is there is something called mind. There's an entity inside our brain which is driving all our activities, all our, what called what we want to do, right? Our actions. But from scientist perspective or science perspective, there's nothing like mind. All our behavior is basically is an emergent property of very different things that happens in the brain. What happens in the brain is triggered by certain sensory inputs. Those sensory inputs with certain past experience come out with certain kinds of behavioral outcome, which we basically call it as cognition. It's a process. It's not just an entity or an outcome, right? It's a process. Consciousness or being aware of yourself is an emergent property, an outcome, which I'll come to that in a minute. So the one way to understand is if everything is evolved phenomena. If for example, my the blood circulation or blood as a tissue, or the lung function or the heart function, the structure function of heart, lungs, all the is evolved phenomena. We can compare with other animals. If we can understand that other animals have similar glucose, other mammals at least have similar glucose metabolism, or the temperature maintenance, the homeostasis, the physiological way of maintaining temperature is common amongst all mammals. If that kind of similarities exist, and obviously there must be a brain also must be an evolved phenomena, and all the features of brain, all the complex cognitive skills that we have must have evolved over time and from other animals to all the way up to human. So that means we should be able to test if other animals also have this understanding of self or so-called consciousness or self-awareness, and how to even test it. Among the humans we can ask. Perhaps we can't ask a human who has a cognitive disability like autistic or someone, but most humans with whom we can talk and have a dialogue, not necessarily with the help vocal language, could also be a body language. We should be able to understand each other. And if I understand what other person is saying, make a mental picture about what other person must be thinking, that basically itself will tell you that this person also has a mind and he is conscious of about herself the way I'm conscious about myself, right? But how do you do this with an animal? So there are a variety of people, testing paradigms people have developed, and in the last decade or 2 decades, a lot of interesting experiments have been done to understand this. I'm going to use only one such experiment. There are experiments using chimpanzees, using macaques, using salamander or fish, all kinds of organisms, dolphins. But I'm going to use the word, a simple fly, which more people want to say that is an ordinary fly. If most of the time you think that a fly's behavior is stereotypic, and but if flies can do, then anybody can do kind of right? And it should not be any surprising what could have evolved with time. So if I can run this movie, so this is a very simple experiment. You take a fly which cuts its wing; it cannot fly. It can walk, and then what you do is you make it to walk on a platform, and when it walks on a platform, you create this kind of a gap. These platforms are made with small blocks, like Lego blocks. You can remove it. And you keep some food on the other side and leave the fly in from one end. It will immediately start walking toward that side. And then if there is a gap, it sort of senses there is a gap because it has certain mechanosensory perception. It's like the way we have. For example, if I see that there is no solid surface, if I take my leg and try to put somewhere, you all feel that how will we feel it? If there is no solid surface, you really get scared if one leg is not touching the floor. So this fly, see what it does is, it tries to stretch its leg looking for a solid surface, and it holds on to the other side. Then only it releases the remaining legs so that it can cross the gap, right? And but sometimes if you increase the gap, sometimes even if you don't increase the gap, some flies, I'll come to that, which kind of flies, it tries to stretch its body, extend its front legs, try to hold on to a solid surface. We don't know whether it knows that it's solid surface at the other end of the gap, or it's simply blindly looking for a solid surface, and it can make mistake, and as you can see here, it fell down. But sometimes if you make the width even wider, or you make the fly blind but you keep it closer. So I asked the question, does it know that there's a gap and it is looking for a solid surface, or is simply because it didn't feel any solid surface in its front leg, it's simply blindly stretching its body and looking for a solid surface here and there? And is it a visual perception, or it's simply mechanosensory perception? And by the way, these are all very fast events. Taking high-speed camera, these videos are made and then running it slowly. All these videos I'm showing are made by Roland Strauss and his students in Mainz in Germany, a good friend of mine. He does these kind of experiments. Many people also now doing these experiments, and he's one of the pioneers. As you can see here, this fly, it comes to the edge, it's going back. It's not even making an attempt to cross the gap. That means visually it is seeing that there's a gap which is not crossable. I mean, of course, this is an assumption that we are making on behalf of the fly. That is not, fly is not telling us that it is not crossable. So one way to test again is, can this fly cross the gap? If it is seeing it and the same fly make it blind, will it cross? So you can make it. So it turned out to be that a fly which can see doesn't crosses the gap, and the same width, the blind fly will not make it cross, because it's not seeing how much is the gap. That means it cannot measure how much is a gap, whether it's crossable or not crossable, and making a wise decision. Then you can ask, what is crossable and not crossable? It depends on its body size. It turned out to be that the flies which are smaller body size, they avoid narrow gaps compared to the flies which are larger body size, which can actually which avoid relatively wider gaps. So suggesting that it has some understanding of its body size, it's some understanding of the distances around it, and body size and its surroundings, it has some understanding the relationship. That means it at least has some self-understanding of its own body size. Whether you call it as self-awareness or awareness of self, whatever it is, at least it has awareness about its body size versus the distances in its surroundings, and then making these kind of decisions, right? So it could be just the beginning of the awareness of self, and which is much more complicated in other animals, including humans. Just to show the same thing in a very fast event, you can see here, it's not making an attempt. Sometimes it tries to make an attempt and go back. This is not even making an attempt. It comes close to the edge and then immediately goes back, right? So it's really interesting way of doing. Now, another way of testing whether we have awareness of self is actually our ability to use tools. Because using tools, you have to make multiple mental calculations about the nature of the tool, which tool is suitable for which particular action that you are doing it. It's not stereotypic simply that you pick up a stick and do certain things. And many animals can do it. Beavers build their dams, or birds build nests, or birds use small tools for foraging purposes. Chimpanzees, you make tools for foraging purposes. Monkeys use small stones to to break open the kernel, so break open the nut and eat the kernel and so forth. All of these things are, clear telltale examples that they have some understanding of the surroundings in the context of what they want from the surrounding, and what they want, and it also depends on their ability in sort of what they can. For example, if a monkey would not be simply trying very different stones. It clearly knows which kind of stone it can hold, which kind of stone it can lift and use it for breaking a nut, right? So obviously, these are the kind of features which may have resultant in the context of evolution of self-awareness. I'll skip some of the movies of this one. The tool-living ability in human is somewhat more because of morphological or anatomical evolution than the cognitive ability. Because of bipedal walking and running, we are better tool users while walking also. At the same time, the higher degree of in the thumb movement, we are actually better tool users and tool makers as well as tool users, like sharp stones and so forth. Another interesting feature that has evolved in many animals, particularly amongst the mammals, including some birds, is the mirror neurons. These mirror neurons, which are thought to be the reasons why we have so-called higher degrees of higher order theory of mind, as well as the awareness of self in multiple different ways, and how we empathize with others, and how we process the language, talk to each other, understand each other. It's all because of these mirror neurons. It's not only visual perception; it also goes beyond visual perception in understanding other members of the group, and although outside the members of the group also, other animals, plants around us, and non-living matter around us. So this basically could be one of the reasons, for the evolution of understanding of self, or so-called self-awareness, and which is not again human-specific. And this famous statement by V.S. Ramachandran about how mirror neurons could have contributed to the evolution of self-awareness in animals, particularly including humans. One test people have done, is in chimpanzees. They are the ones, other than humans, which can actually see in a mirror and identify the image in the mirror is themselves, and then they can do all kinds of manipulation to their face, looking at a mirror. The way we, for example, comb our hair or shave our face and kind of thing, and all of these things are pretty possible. Only you have higher order self-awareness in our cognitive abilities. And most of the things we thought until 50 years ago, people thought that human-specific people have realized that they are there amongst other animals too, like awareness of awareness, compassion, cooperation and sharing, recognition of facial expression, and of course language, most animals do have. Then the question comes, what is so unique about us? Perhaps one possibility is each one of these traits, specifically of some of the 4 or 5 different traits, which may be one order more complex in human than other animals, including non-human primates. But again, there's no clear evidence that suddenly humans have evolved these special features. Perhaps it's only one small step which has changed in humans, which has led to all of these things. That small change is our ability to use the long sentences, or ability to make long sentences with few, and also multiple sentences using fewer words, through our ability to make and use syntactic language. Now, syntactic language is our ability to communicate whatever your thoughts in your brain, what you saw, what you experienced, what you thought about something, you can tell others people, and you can keep telling others people, in a sequence. So that means information can flow from one person to another person, both horizontally and vertically, and beyond our own existence. So the information that I have gathered, or whatever I've understood about my own surroundings based on my experience, I can transfer to other people, and that can perpetuate in the population across the time scale because of our ability to use this language. And this syntactic language is there in other animals too, including, for example, I told you songbirds have. And recently I also found out that some of the babblers, birds also have syntactic language. But humans have one order higher complexity in our ability to use languages making these syntaxes, right? And that basically helped to understand each other much more comprehensively. And we can actually communicate so well. We can also understand each other well. Sometimes we can also deceive. I know how you understand something, and I know how to, deceive you by telling you, using the same language in a completely different thing. What you call as fake information or mythology and kind of stuff. So myths and kind of stuff. So in a way, the language is the one which has made us what we are, right? So as the individuals, we are all like single computers, but because of this language, we are like a supercomputer. All these computers are connected to each other, and then a supercomputer has emerged. So without this language, we are like any other animal. Because of this language, humanity has evolved. So humanity is different than humans. Humans are like any other animals, but humanity is an emergent property of human evolution because of this language. And that has enabled us to all of these things, including this Zoom talk that I'm giving in front of all of you. Although physically I'm not, we are not in the same space. So that's what language is the driver of the cultural evolution that we are experiencing today, and all the other aspect of it, including analytical, critical thinking. Then science itself is a product of this language evolution, and all that we have been able to understand as well as do, and also unfortunately very destructive. Just end my talk in 1 minute. Sorry, I'm taking slightly longer than I thought. So because Karthik's email about these lecture series also talks about what's happened to the world in this Quaternary period. The Earth, which has gone through natural change over time, all kinds of turbulent time it has gone through. But the last few 100 years, or last 300 years rather, what's going on? It's beyond anybody's sort of imagination. It's much more negative impact on Earth. It's because of the global warming or the climate change that is created by us. But interestingly, before I talk about that one, the solution, both the cause and the solution is the same. Because of this language, we have been able to innovate so many things. Not only we started this language and talking to each other and creating, cumulatively, using this knowledge that is being generated by multiple individuals, and then using for the advancement of new knowledge and also technology. The same, our ability also has harmed the Earth. But we also have an opportunity, again, because of the language. Not only we have the language, we have the technology to connect to each other in real time and across the globe. Earlier, if few hundred people could talk to each other, but it used to take centuries to talk to each other. Like when the Indians invented number system, it took perhaps a few centuries before it spread to the rest of the world. But now anything that happens in real time, we can come to know each other. That's exactly how we solved the COVID-19 pandemic. And in real time, we used to understand what's happening, that would be the appropriate solutions, and so forth. And within 1 year of the pandemic, we could come out of it by developing vaccine, right? Now, within 1.5 years or so. So that's the advantage of having, if we selflessly connect to each other and share the language, share the knowledge, not the language. Perhaps we should be able to work together and for the betterment of the Earth and betterment of life on Earth and ourselves, right? And that's what the challenge and also the solution. The challenge is, of course, the climate change, the global warming, and the environmental destruction. And the solution is using our own abilities, what caused this, and reverse it. And to reverse it, obviously, we all have to work together, and we have the technology to work together, right? And that precisely is the solution, right? I'll skip this. environmental security, what we really need is a good education for this and good technology for this, and it has to be sustainable. And it's very, very important that environmental security should be the prime, prime focus, and not about any other aspect of development. We're continuously talking about wars, continuously talking about making new weapons, new aircrafts, or new other things. But no one is talking about environmental security. Without environmental security, everything else becomes, completely useless, right? And in time, it's really, we don't have much time left also, And for this, we need new innovation to happen. We develop new innovation skills, and for that, we need to, train our new generations, and that comes when we train, our people in judicial use of natural resources, and that's where the world should move. And for this, in my personal opinion, perhaps I don't know how many of you will agree, Gandhian economy is the most important way of dealing with this. Because Gandhian economy is more decentralized, and that's the green economy. Green economy is where you use natural resources very judiciously, minimally, and reduce the consumption, as well as reduce the energy for sharing the resources. If you keep transporting material thousands of kilometers, if the same material is made locally, there's so much energy saved, so much of environmental protection can happen, and that's what Gandhian economy is all about. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.